When the first snow was just beginning to fall on the village roofs, Elizabeth stood in the middle of her yard and looked at what she had built with her own hands. A greenhouse. A huge, strange structure made of old windows, boards, and transparent film. Neighbors gathered by the fence and exchanged glances, some giggling, some shaking their heads. Laughter echoed through the narrow streets, reaching the woman's ears, but she didn't show that it bothered her. Robert, a local farmer with rough hands and an even rougher character, spoke loudly about how nothing would grow in such a structure in winter. His wife Margaret nodded in agreement, saying that Elizabeth would be better off making preserves like all normal people. Other villagers silently agreed. Some simply walked by, casting mocking glances. Elizabeth didn't respond to the provocations. She simply wiped the dirt from her hands and went inside her creation. Behind her walked her 10-year-old daughter Sophie, a thin girl with serious eyes and hands perpetually dirty with soil. The child learned to ignore the mockery even better than her mother because she saw unwavering confidence in Elizabeth's eyes. Inside the greenhouse, it was warm. Elizabeth had thought through every detail: double walls for insulation, a potbelly stove in the corner, a ventilation system, lamps for supplemental lighting of plants during the short winter days. She had spent the entire summer on this, all her savings and all the village's mockery. But she knew something the others didn't. She saw signs that the rest ignored. Sophie held a watering can and silently walked along the rows of seedlings. The girl had inherited her mother's methodical nature and patience. They worked in silence, broken only by the sound of pouring water and the rustling of leaves. This was their refuge, their secret world, where the mockery of the outside world had no power. Elizabeth was an agronomist. She used to work at a large research institute in the city, studying climate, crop rotation, plant resistance to extreme conditions. But when the institute closed due to funding cuts, she returned to her native village with a small daughter in her arms. Here she started everything anew: a vegetable garden, a small farm, life without a husband who had left, unable to bear the poverty and prospect of life away from the city. But Elizabeth didn't give up. She read a lot, followed weather forecasts, studied reports from climatologists around the world. And increasingly, she came across alarming data: abnormal cold in neighboring regions, crop failures spreading like an epidemic, disruptions in food supplies, road closures due to early snowfalls. She saw a pattern that others refused to notice, and she prepared for what seemed inevitable. The greenhouse was her bet, her insurance, her hope that when the worst came, she could protect her daughter and possibly help those who were now laughing at her efforts. Sophie helped her mother every day. The girl had matured early. When there's no father in the family and little money, childhood leaves faster than one would like. But she didn't complain. She enjoyed working next to her mother, seeing how tiny seeds produced sprouts, how fruits ripened, how their shared labor turned into something alive and real. At school, classmates teased her for her dirty hands and old clothes, but Sophie learned not to pay attention to it. One morning, the girl discovered the first red tomato among the greenery. Her eyes lit up with joy, and she called her mother. Elizabeth smiled, a rare, warm smile that only her daughter saw. This small victory meant more than those around could understand. It was proof that the system worked, that all the calculations had been correct. The neighbors continued to laugh. In autumn, when the harvest had been gathered and canned in jars, someone said that Elizabeth had finally lost her mind. Why bother with a greenhouse when you can just buy everything at the market? Money wasted, time lost, and all for what? For a few tomatoes? But the market soon emptied, and the laughter died down. Winter came early and harsh, as Elizabeth had predicted. Already in October, the first frosts hit, which usually came only in November. And in mid-November, snow fell, dense, heavy, merciless. Such a snowfall was not remembered even by the village elders. The roads were buried in one night. Snow removal equipment couldn't cope. Trucks stopped coming to the village. The store closed. Goods weren't delivered, and what remained on the shelves was bought up in the first days of panic. Then came what everyone feared, but no one expected so soon: crop failure. Throughout the entire region, potatoes rotted in the ground due to abnormal summer rains. Grain crops didn't have time to ripen before the early frosts. Vegetables blackened on the stem. People were left with only the supplies they had made themselves. But many hadn't had time. Many had relied on stores, on the government, on someone else taking care of their well-being. And so famine began in the village. At first quiet, hidden behind closed doors. People shared their last, cooked thin soups from what they had. But with each week the shelves and homes emptied. Preserves ran out. Grains melted away before their eyes. Children began to lose weight. Their cheeks hollowed. Their eyes grew larger. Parents gave them their portions, remaining hungry themselves. And in Elizabeth's greenhouse, a light burned. Every evening, when windows in the village went dark to save electricity and firewood, one structure glowed from within with a soft yellow light. There, behind transparent walls, while the world froze, tomatoes grew. Cucumbers, lettuce, radishes, peppers, greens. Life continued despite everything. Elizabeth heated the potbelly stove with firewood she had prepared in advance, a whole shed that she had filled all summer while others rested. She turned on the lamps for several hours a day, giving the plants the necessary light for photosynthesis. She and Sophie tended to each bush, watered on schedule, fed them with fertilizer she had made herself from compost, talked to the plants like living beings, giving them their energy and faith. And the greenhouse answered them with a harvest. Modest, but constant. Enough to feed two, and maybe someone else. Sophie ran to the greenhouse every day after school, which was still operating despite the cold. She learned to determine which plants needed water, which needed feeding, which needed additional light. The girl kept an observation diary, as her mother taught her, recording temperature, humidity, the condition of each plant. This was her small scientific work, her contribution to the common cause of survival. Eleanor came first, an elderly woman who had previously laughed the loudest at Elizabeth's foolish endeavor. She stood at the gate, hunched over, with an empty bag in trembling hands. Her face was gaunt. Her eyes had lost their former mockery. Elizabeth opened the door and silently nodded, inviting her inside. When Eleanor entered the greenhouse, she stopped dead in her tracks. Warmth enveloped her frozen body. Moist air, smelling of earth and fresh plants, filled her lungs. Green rose, full of life, when outside the window lay dead snow and white emptiness reigned. It was like entering another world, a parallel reality where winter had no power. The old woman couldn't hold back tears. They rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, dripping onto the greenhouse floor. Elizabeth silently collected vegetables into a bag: tomatoes, cucumbers, greens, a little radish. Not much, but enough to maintain strength. Eleanor pressed the bag to her chest like the greatest treasure, her lips moving in silent gratitude. The next day Robert came, that very farmer who had said everything would freeze by December. He was silent, standing on the threshold, then took off his hat and lowered his eyes. His pride was broken by hunger and fear for his wife. Elizabeth gave him peppers and tomatoes, not uttering a word of reproach. His gratitude was written on his face, in every wrinkle, in his reddened eyes. Then came Diana, a young mother with a child in her arms. Then elderly George, living alone on the edge of the village. Then another family, and another, and another. Every day new faces appeared at Elizabeth's gate. Some came with shame, others with desperation, still others simply with hope. Elizabeth gave a little to each. Not everything. She understood that she needed to stretch the supplies, that there was still a long winter ahead, that the harvest wasn't infinite. But she refused no one. She kept strict records, calculated portions, planned how to distribute what there was to last until spring. Sophie stood next to her mother and silently handed out vegetables. Her small hands worked quickly and deftly, packing the produce. She remembered the faces, the same faces that had laughed at them in the summer. But the girl held no grudge. She saw their fear, their desperation, their sincere gratitude. She understood that her mother was doing the right thing and was proud of her more than words could express. But resources are not infinite, and Elizabeth knew this well. Firewood ran out faster than she had calculated. Winter was too harsh. Lamps burned out one after another, and there was nowhere to get new ones. The soil was depleting despite all efforts to restore it. The harvest became smaller with each week. Elizabeth slept 3 hours a day, trying to squeeze the maximum from the greenhouse. But even she couldn't deceive nature. And then something happened that she didn't expect. People began to return. But this time, they didn't come empty-handed. Robert brought firewood, all his supply, leaving himself the minimum. He simply silently stacked it by the greenhouse and left. Eleanor dragged old lamps found in the attic, covered with dust, but working. The young teacher Thomas came with fertilizer he had been storing for spring planting. Diana brought seeds she had been saving for the future. The greenhouse ceased to be Elizabeth's personal project. It became a common cause, a common hope, the common heart of the village, which beat despite the frost and hunger. Elizabeth organized a system. She taught people how to work with plants, how to water properly so as not to flood the roots, how to feed so as not to burn the leaves, how to identify diseases in early stages. Sophie became her assistant and interpreter. The girl explained to other children, showed them, encouraged them, turned into a little teacher. The greenhouse was no longer just a structure of glass and wood. It became a living organism tended by the entire village. A place where people met not only for food, but also for communication, support, hope. Here they forgot about the cold outside, about fear of the future, about their grievances and disagreements. And the miracle continued to happen. Vegetables grew, slowly but steadily. Each new fruit was a small victory over winter, over hunger, over despair. The most difficult moment came in February, when winter decided to show all its might. A frost of -35 hit, a temperature that hadn't occurred in these parts for decades. The wind howled like a wounded beast, trying to break through the greenhouse walls, finding every crack, every weak spot. The firewood ran out completely. All the lamps burned out, every single one. The temperature inside the greenhouse began to drop rapidly. Elizabeth stood in the middle of her creation, and for the first time all winter felt real fear. Not for herself. She had long stopped thinking about herself. Fear for her daughter. Fear for the village. If the greenhouse froze now, in the middle of winter, when there were still 2 months until spring, the village wouldn't survive. Too many already depended completely on these plants. Sophie stood nearby, her small hand squeezing her mother's hand. The girl wasn't crying, but the same fear could be read in her eyes. They both understood that this was a critical moment, that now the fate was being decided not only of the greenhouse, but of all the people around. Outside the greenhouse window, people began to gather. First a few people, then a dozen, then the entire village. They brought everything that could burn. Old furniture they had treasured for years, boards from sheds, fences, even books. Women brought blankets and warm things to wrap the most vulnerable plants. Men sealed cracks in the walls with rags, clay, anything that could hold the precious heat inside. Robert organized shifts at the stove. Thomas made a duty schedule. Eleanor directed the wrapping of plants. Everyone found something to do. Everyone contributed to saving what had become a symbol of their survival. People worked all night without a break. They stoked the stove, changing every hour so as not to freeze themselves. They covered plants with their hands, with their warmth. They kept watch, giving their energy, their faith, their hope. No one complained about the cold, about fatigue, about pain in frozen fingers. Sophie fell asleep right on the greenhouse floor, wrapped in someone's old sheepskin coat, surrounded by adults who continued to work. Elizabeth stroked her daughter's head and looked at these people, the very ones who had laughed at her just a few months ago. Now they were fighting for what she had believed in from the very beginning. They had become one family, united by a common goal. By morning, the frost began to retreat. The sky brightened. The wind died down. The temperature rose to -20. People inspected the plants. Most had survived. There were losses, some bushes froze, but the main mass had withstood thanks to the common effort. Spring finally came in mid-April, late, uncertain, but real. Snow began to melt slowly, revealing earth blackened by the cold. Roads gradually opened. Trucks with food came to the village, aid from the region, which itself had barely survived this catastrophic winter. But Elizabeth's greenhouse was still working. It was no longer the only source of food. The store opened. They brought flour, grains, canned goods, even fresh vegetables from southern regions. But people continued to come to the greenhouse, because it had become something more than just a source of vegetables. It had become a symbol of hope, a symbol that one can prepare for the worst, that one can refuse to give up when everyone says the idea is crazy, that one person with faith and perseverance can change the fate of an entire village. And it also became a symbol of unity, proof that together people can overcome any trials. In summer, Elizabeth held the first general meeting in the village. All the residents came, everyone without exception, young and old. She spoke about her observations, about climate changes, about the fact that the past winter might not be the last so severe. People listened attentively, without mockery, without skepticism. They remembered the cold. They remembered the hunger. They remembered the warm light of the greenhouse among the dead snow. Elizabeth offered to help anyone who wanted to build their own greenhouse. Sophie also volunteered to help. Robert offered to organize a common fund of materials. Thomas volunteered to conduct educational courses for children and adults. And they began to build. By autumn, there were already 5 full greenhouses in the village. People shared knowledge, seeds, tools, experience. Robert organized a common firewood warehouse, to which each family contributed. Eleanor began to collect a library of books on agronomy, ordering them through the restored postal service. Sophie grew more during this winter than in all previous years. Now she taught other children what she had learned herself: care for plants, patience, planning, faith in the future. The girl became a little celebrity in the village, and adults listened to her advice on par with her mother's advice. And Elizabeth stood by her greenhouse, that very first one that had been laughed at, and smiled. She didn't seek fame or recognition, didn't expect gratitude or apologies. She simply did what she considered right, following her knowledge and intuition. And this saved not only her and Sophie. This saved everyone. Several years passed. The village became known throughout the region as a place that learned to defeat hunger and bad weather. Agronomists from universities, journalists from capital newspapers, students from all over the country came here to learn how a small community turned crisis into opportunity, weakness into strength. Sophie entered an agricultural university, winning a scholarship thanks to her project on winter vegetable growing. But every vacation she returned home and worked in the greenhouse with her mother. After graduating from university, the young woman returned to the village forever and built her own greenhouse, even bigger, even more perfect, with automated watering and heating systems. But she always said that the first greenhouse, her mother's, was the most important, because it was built not just from glass and wood. It was built from faith, hope, and love. Elizabeth grew old. Her hair turned gray. Her hands became wrinkled, but she didn't stop. She continued to work, teach, help everyone who asked for advice. And every time someone came to her with a new idea or doubts, she repeated the same words that had become the village motto: don't be afraid to be first. Don't be afraid of mockery and misunderstanding. Do what is right, following your inner voice. And sooner or later people will understand. And if they don't understand, you will still be ready for what lies ahead. Preparation is more important than mockery. Action is stronger than words. The greenhouse still stood in the same place. Still worked, yielding harvest year-round. Still glowed in the evenings with a soft yellow light that was visible from any point in the village. And in this light were not just vegetables and warmth. In it was hope for the future, memory of the past, and faith that a person is capable of overcoming any trials if they have knowledge, perseverance, and support of loved ones. The village prospered. Winter greenhouses became its calling card. Tourists came to see this miracle of agricultural technology. Local residents sold surplus harvest to neighboring settlements, creating a small but stable income. Children learned from an early age to care for plants, understand nature, plan for the future. And it all began with one woman who wasn't afraid to be different, who believed in her knowledge when everyone around doubted, who built a greenhouse not only for vegetables, but also for hope.